The White House is intensifying threats and pressure on Cuba, signaling the island may well be next in its campaign to reassert dominance all across the Western Hemisphere. Today, Trump wrote on Truth Social that there will not be any more money or oil going from Venezuela to Cuba. And, quote, I strongly suggest they make a deal before it is too late. It's unclear what kind of deal Trump was referring to there. Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel hit back at the Trump administration today, writing in a translation from Spanish, quote, Cuba is a free, independent, and sovereign nation. No one dictates what we do. Cuba does not aggress. It is aggressed upon by the United States for 66 years, and it does not threaten. Paulo Ramos is still here at the table with us, and now also with us is John Gutierrez, a Cuban historian and assistant professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. It's great to have both of you here.
Nice to have you.
Paula, I'll start with you. So Cubans, of course, they want free speech, they want opportunity and prosperity. But as you see the way that Trump, Rubio, and others around them are talking about this potential action, this step, do you think it's about democracy or something else?
No, I don't think we've seen anything that indicates that they truly care about democracy. However, there's not the same economic incentives in Cuba as there are in Venezuela. Right. Perhaps Trump sees what the Spaniards saw during colonialism, right? Which is, yes, Cuba can be like the pearl of the Caribbean. Maybe he sees that Cuba can turn into like the French Riviera, fine. But I think truly, this is about the perfect story for them, right? Like the full circle, being able to say, we did what JFK wasn't able to do with the Bay of Pigs, right? We did what no American president has been able to do, really crush that Cold War era communism, bring down the Castro regime. It's a great story. Now, is there a moral incentive for someone like Marco Rubio? Yes, right? I mean, he's the son of Cuban immigrants. I'm sure he really cares about democracy, but I think the history here is that this does not end well.
Well, John, and that's what I want to get into with you. How is this different from over 6 decades of a blockade and the regime has stayed intact?
Right.
What makes this moment different or not?
I'm not quite sure how different it is, right? I'm old enough to remember when the Berlin Wall came down, and in 1992, Andrés Oppenheimer wrote a book that's probably on the bookshelves of most Cuba scholars called Castro's Final Hour. Fidel lived for another decade after that book was published. So I try not to bet against the resilience to the point, I think, of insanity of the Cuban regime. Things are going to become much more difficult. If you cut off Venezuelan petroleum, the economic situation on the island is going to become catastrophic. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the regime collapses. And I think that's something that in Washington, people are going to have to contend with. What do you do with a nation that is collapsing but refuses to yield? And that's a real possibility.
John, can you elaborate on what you mean when you say it would be catastrophic if, in fact, the oil stops flowing to Cuba, as Trump says?
Venezuela provides most of the petroleum going into Cuba, and even that's not enough. There are long lines for gas. The island, my most recent visit was about a year ago, in areas of Havana that had traditionally been immune from sort of the kind of economic crisis of old Havana, say crumbling buildings, that kind of stuff. In places like Bedalu, trash is piling up, buses are not running, there are power outages on a regular basis, and so that's with Venezuelan oil moving into the country. Without that, it's unclear. There's no other supplier. The Russians can't do it. Mexico can provide petroleum for Cuba, but it says that it's not going to increase its petroleum investment wisely because it's going to anger the United States in doing that. I just think I don't know how they fix the problem, except that they have always had this. And I hate to say it, but the national model of patria o muerte is a real thing, at least for the regime. And I don't know that they are interested in in a negotiation, which is what gets them out of this.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, I hate to ask our guests to put themselves in like President Trump's mind, but when he says like they need to make a deal before it's too late, first of all, what does an actual deal look like? What are the demands of the Americans? I mean, is it simply that the regime dissolve itself and go to free and fair elections? I mean, what, on the spectrum of demands that Donald Trump could make to make potential deal, what are some of the things that he would ask for, and what are some of the things that could be accepted? Because there was a time when President Obama actually went to Cuba and there was a deal, just the same way there was a deal with the Iranians that Donald Trump came in the first administration and totally blew up, and here we are.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that the president knows what he wants.
Looks, yeah.
Right.
But it'll be a good deal.
It'll be a good deal.
It'll be the
He's
best.
the man of the art of the deal, right? But I think there are a couple of things. One is the release of political prisoners. There were massive protests for the first time in Cuban history in July of 2021. There are a lot of people who are sitting in prisons, many of whom were convicted and sentenced to prison as teenagers for taking to the streets. I think they'll call for the release of those political prisoners. They'll call for some type of opening to American capital, which, quite frankly, is something that the Soviet Union told the Cubans to do in the 1970s. And Fidel refused because the Eastern Bloc nations saw in Cuba mismanagement. They saw what the writing on the wall, so to speak, but Fidel refused to break. And I think what might be different in this case is that Fidel is gone. Right? Raul is still there, but he's 90 some odd years old. Diaz-Canel doesn't have the same kind of heft that the Castro brothers had. So maybe he finds the space to have a negotiation, to yield some. But it's a weird place. You know, it's the constant, like, again, patria o muerte. Like, I don't know they've sort of backed themselves into a corner, and I don't know if they know or are willing to make the concessions to get out of it.
I just think you mentioned Obama. I just keep thinking of how Obama was criticized so much in 2015 when he dared to even attempt to make a deal with the Cuban government, right? And here you have a Trump, and the first one to criticize him was Marco Rubio. I mean, Marco Rubio in 2015, when Obama tried to normalize, went insane. And what Trump is showing us is that they are willing to negotiate, to make deals with even the Venezuelan regime. It may look different, but it's still the regime, and even now potentially with Cuba.
Because they want to be the ones to make the deal, because it's the same thing that happened with Iran, right? Like they took themselves out of the JCPOA and then spent half a year trying to negotiate themselves back into a JCPOA until they were.
I just don't see how Rubio could work with Canel and all those other, like that same setup. I just don't think, because of the dynamic you're describing of people like choosing death over collaboration with the United States, it would have to be a complete restructure and annihilation for that to work.
The problem is that if you look at Cuba, the only institution that really works in Cuba is the military, right?
Where's the military right now?
And so you're going to have to deal with these people. They control the hotels, they control weapons. It's the only part of the country that functions.
And has billions of dollars.
And has a lot of money behind it. And so I think if I'm sitting in Washington looking at this mess, I'm saying to myself, I'm going to have to deal with, the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces. I don't have much of a choice.
And on that hopeful note,
sorry,
Paulo Ramos and John Gutierrez, thank you both.